Hello students, welcome to another session of human respiration, that is life processes. So last session we talked about what is respiration and what are the types of respiration, and we also understood like what are the different pigments which are involved and what are the different processes which are involved in respiration. And we also understood what are the different organs of respiration in the lower organisms. Now, continuing this forward, let's take up to the next topic, that is human respiration. So you all know why you breathe. So why do you breathe? Because you want to take in air, which is like oxygen. And why is it like only oxygen? We will discuss that in the later portion of the session. Now, we have different respiratory pigments, but we will be talking about only human respiratory system here. But we will try to understand what are the other kinds of pigments involved in this particular respiration. Now, what are we going to see today? So you can have it on the screen. So we will be talking about human respiratory system. What are the different parts in the human respiratory system? And what is that? It makes it special when it comes to complex organisms. Then you will see what are the other organs which help in processing this particular one. And what are the different steps involved in respiration. And how exactly the exchange of gases takes place. That is where it takes place and how it takes place. Then the importance of the pigment, that is hemoglobin. So we'll be talking about other pigments in this particular topic. Now, so this particular caption you always see on the cigarette packets, that is smoking is injurious to health. We will try to understand why smoking is very, very harmful for the health and what are the conditions it can create for a longer period of time. So with this introduction, we will be looking at one by one the topics. Now, on the screen, you have the structure of human respiratory system. On to the left, you have the lungs. And here on to the right, you have different parts of the respiratory system. Now, what are the different parts of the respiratory system? You have, starting with, we will just touch the parts first. When we spoke about the digestive system, we said there is a common point between the digestive as well as the respiratory system. The common point will always be the mouth cavity, otherwise given as the buccal cavity. Now, what was the structure I gave in the last session that will divide the respiratory system and the digestive system? What is that particular part? Right, the particular part will be epiglottis. So which we said it is a flap-like structure which will separate the digestive system as well as the respiratory system according to the function which is taking up. Now, the epiglottis is generally present at the region of glottis. So let's take up one by one. The mouth cavity, that is a common point, and the nasal passage. Now, we all breathe by means of two external nostrils. So we do have an external nostril, which is not present in most of the animals. Now, external nostrils are otherwise called as the external nares. So another name for nostrils will be nares. Now, external nostrils will lead into the internal nostrils. That is what is called as the nasal passage. Now, this nasal passage will enter what the mouth cavity or the buccal cavity. Now, this is a passage of that particular respiration. So, this nasal passage will contain the internal nostrils. So, the external nostrils will enter the internal nostrils, otherwise called as the internal nares. Now, what is present in that particular internal nares that will help you to filter the air what we are breathing. So every time we take in the breath or every time we breathe, there is always filtration of the unwanted substances when it enters your internal nostrils. Now, what is that respiratory thing? So we have cilia or hair-like processes which are generally present in the internal nostrils. And now, what is the function of this particular cilia? Now, this cilia will guard the air and to make it free of germs as well as dust particles. So only then the internal nostrils will allow the passage of the air to the next part, that is the buccal cavity, or also called as the buccopharyngeal cavity. Now, the germs and the dust particles are taken care of during this particular process, and that is how the cilia is helpful. Now, once it enters the internal nares, it has to reach the mouth cavity. From the mouth cavity, it enters a short part, which is called the muscular pharynx. Now, when we studied the digestive system, we said that muscular pharynx is again divided into two types, that is the oropharynx, and the other one is called the nasopharynx. Now, oropharynx is the partition which leads into the food pipe, that is the esophagus, whereas the nasopharynx will lead into the next part, that is the larynx and the trachea. Now, this is the area where you find this particular flap-like structure, which this area near the larynx. So you can see the larynx here, just above this, you will have a part called glottis. So glottis is in exactly the same portion where you find the tonsils. So you all know what are tonsils. You must have experienced when you are like kids. So the tonsils will be guarded by this particular part, which is called as the larynx. Now, what exactly is larynx? So have you ever understood that how you actually give out a sound from your throat? So sound box or larynx is the part which helps you to produce that particular sound. Now, larynx are organs which contain vocal cords. Now, this vocal cords will have a small cartilage in between. Now, there is a small hole in between the vocal cords which will allow the air to enter as we breathe. Now, when the air enters, that it triggers that cartilage which helps you to make that particular sound. So larynx is otherwise called as the voice box. So many men, when they have come to the maturity levels, you find there is enlargement of this particular larynx. This is called as the Adam's apple. So this Adam's apple is seen not in all the men, but some of the men will have this enlargement during the puberty levels. And now this is called as the Adam's apple. And larynx or the voice box leads into one more structure, that is a muscular trachea. So here we have written here rings of cartilage. Now, what are these rings of cartilage and why we have taken this in this particular area, that is trachea? Now, trachea is otherwise called as the windpipe or the air passage, the windpipe, which has this rings of cartilage. Now, why do we need this ring of cartilage? The rings of cartilage will help eventually. So you can see it here. There are rings of cartilage which are half circle or otherwise called as the C-shaped cartilage. Now, what are these C-shaped cartilaginous rings? Now, this cartilage rings will help the trachea to remain in that particular position, so that even when the air is not present inside our nostrils, it will still maintain that particular state. Now, this is to only help the trachea not to collapse. So this C-shaped rings of cartilage will help to protect the trachea not to collapse. Now, this is very important because without this C-shaped cartilage, the trachea will not maintain its position. Now, as you enter down, you will see the trachea is dividing into two. Now, what are these two? Now, these two are the bronchi. Okay. So this bronchi, initially we call it as a primary bronchus. And remember, bronchi is plural and singular, we call it as a bronchus. Now, primary bronchi will divide into two and it enters each of the lungs, that is onto the right and the left side. Now, why does it branch? Because it has to move inside the lungs. Now, the primary bronchus will divide into the next one, which is called as the secondary bronchus. Now, this secondary bronchi will divide back into the tertiary bronchi, and then the bronchi will branch out into small capillary-like structures, which are called as the bronchioles. Now, all these bronchioles will end up in certain sac-like structures, which are called as the alveolar sacs. Now, what do these alveolar sacs contain? They contain alveoli. Now, this alveoli is the seat of lot of capillaries. So, whenever we have seen in whatever internal organs we have seen, whenever there is an exchange needed between the gases or the blood, whatever it is, now we all look at capillaries, because capillaries are the thinnest of blood vessels, which will help in this particular exchange. So here on the screen, we have the structure of an alveoli. Now, these are all the alveolar sacs. Now, what do they contain? Small alveoli, which is very important for the exchange of gases. So if you get a question, where does the exchange actually take place? It takes place in the alveoli. And here you have lots of capillaries. Okay, so now alveoli, there are about roughly 300 to 350 alveoli in each lung. Now, this alveoli not only helps in exchange of gases, it will also help you to increase the area of absorption of that particular gas, that is oxygen. So whenever you need greater amount of surface area, this alveoli also helps, just like the villi, what we have seen in the intestine. Now, alveoli, if you spread the 300 to 350 alveoli, so the alveoli can be spread across 80 meters square. That is 80 square meter, it will extend. That means so much of platform is present for this particular exchange of gases. Okay, now these are the different parts. And now you can see a diaphragm. You can see a diaphragm. Now, what is a diaphragm? This diaphragm will help the lungs to be in position. That is, the lungs are kept in position by means of this particular diaphragm. And now, what do the lungs contain in between? In between the lungs, you have the heart. So in between this, you will find there is a small heart. So the entire heart, that is the region of the heart and the lungs, are all closed by means of a skeleton. So this skeletal system, that is a part of the skeletal system, which we call it as the rib cage. Now, this rib cage will help to protect the lungs as well as the heart, so that there's no external damage or injury to those particular parts. Now, what are ribs? Ribs are a part of the skeletal system, which forms the thoracic cavity, and the ribs are attached in front. See, in front, they're all attached by means of the breastbone or the sternum. So onto the front side, you have the sternum, and then they are attached to the back by means of a vertebral column. Now, that's why we call it as a rib cage, because it is like a cage which is attached in front through the sternum and back through the vertebral column. Now, this will protect this particular organs, but there is another function when it comes to rib cage. During respiratory process, you will find even the ribs as well as the diaphragm help in all this process. So these organs, we will give the term accessory organs. Now, these are the different parts of human respiratory system, and we will try to understand it better. Now, accessory organs I already gave you. Now, these are the ribs. Now, this is the center portion, which is called the sternum or the breastbone. And remember, this is your front side. That means it is ventral in position. So sternum or the breastbone will be ventral side, and the back portion, that is the dorsal portion, you will have your backbone or the spinal cord, or which is enclosed in a vertebral column. So you can see it is like a cage which is attached to the back as well as the front. Now, this is the vertebral column which is present at the back side. The entire thing, we call it as a rib cage. Now, rib cage here, this portion, you will have the diaphragm. And you find there are two different types of muscles in this particular area. So the muscles in general are called as the coastal muscles. Okay, now what is their function? Why do we need these coastal muscles? Now these coastal muscles are divided again into internal and external coastal muscles. Now, what are these muscles and where do they come from? These muscles are all formed from the rib cage, and the internal coastal muscles and the external coastal muscles, both of them help in making this particular process. Now, internal, we will be talking about these two muscles when we do how the respiration happens. Now, these are the accessory organs which help in respiration: the diaphragm, the ribs which are present here, the breastbone, as well as the spinal cord at the back. All of them will aid you during respiration. Now, let's try to understand what exactly happens when you take in air. So we all know from the lower classes that whenever you take in air, you take generally oxygen. So taking of air will happen through the external nostrils, and that we call it as inspiration. So inspiration or inhalation, where you take in oxygen, and the opposite of that, when we give out carbon dioxide, we call it as expiration or exhalation, right? Now, we all think that we take in oxygen, we leave out carbon dioxide, but it is not the fact that whenever we breathe in air, it is only oxygen which we breathe. We all breathe other gases also. Along with what we have, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, many gases come inside our body. But the maximum amount which is helpful for that particular respiratory process, because we all live on oxygen, we have more amount of oxygen being taken in. So carbon dioxide, the other way, we say expiration, that is we give out from inside, but along with carbon dioxide, a little bit of oxygen is also released during this particular process. But since the amounts vary, we take in more oxygen, breathe out more carbon dioxide, we call that these two gases are present during inspiration and expiration. So remember, these two are the important steps. Now, whenever we take in air and then we give out air, that simple process, we call it as breathing. So we all breathe. And this is an involuntary action. It is not under our control. It is guarded by the nervous system. So this breathing is an involuntary action which is performed on a regular basis. Now, breathing means just taking in air and then giving out air. That is oxygen and carbon dioxide. So in general, we breathe about 12 to 15 times per minute. And I am sure many of you must have experienced when you have vigorous exercise, running, or doing any kind of activities, you will find that your breathing rates do go up. That is because you need more oxygen. You will start breathing heavily and you take in more oxygen. So in general, a normal rate of breathing is 12 to 15 times per minute. That is the average breathing rate. Now, after breathing, what happens inside? So you can see the mechanism, what is happening. This is inhalation. And this is exhalation. So you can see the muscles, whatever you have it here, the ribs and all, what are the changes you can find here. So this inhalation, you see generally the diaphragm is in the form of a curve. That is, it is semicircular in shape. So this is the shape of the normal diaphragm. But during inspiration, you find the diaphragm is contracted. That is, it becomes more flattened. It becomes more flattened. And why does it do so? Why does it do so? Because it needs to expand the cavity which is present inside. Now, this is the chest cavity, which expands first with the diaphragm, and then the ribs which are present have to be pulled backward. So whenever you pull your chest backward, you give an expansive property to it. So these ribs can be expanded by means of the costal muscles, which we talk, that is the internal costal muscles. So now the chest cavity is bigger, the diaphragm is flattened, and the sternum is also projected towards the outside. So automatically that is the absorptive, the air capacity increases inside the particular one. Now what happens when air enters, it fills these areas, and then this process we call it as inhalation. Now what happens exactly reverse when we take out air? So the reverse has to happen. The diaphragm relaxes and it comes back to the normal position. You can see it here. Then the chest becomes smaller by contraction. Here it is expansion, here it is contraction. And for it to contract, you need what is called as the same costal muscles, but here we give the name external costal muscles. Okay, so because of these muscles, the chest cavity decreases, and then the diaphragm relaxes, it comes back to the normal position. And so the carbon dioxide which is present inside the lung is squeezed out of the nostrils. Now this opposite way, where this is the mechanism we were talking about when I said you're taking in air and giving out air. Now you can see, I hope you have understood this, because here all of them are involved. So these are all the accessory organs and the muscles which help in this process. Now, so the steps will be inspiration and expiration. So looking at the diagram, we understood that what happens, what are the differences between these two. Now in inspiration, that is when you take in air, your chest cavity increases. Here it decreases. You find the ribs are pulled outward by means of costal muscles. That is the internal costal muscles. And now here the muscles are contracted, and which makes the chest cavity smaller, and the muscles which help in are called as the external costal muscles. So, process of respiration. Now, where do the exchange of gases take place? The exchange of gases take place in the alveoli. And we already talked about it. Alveoli has a great absorptive capacity and it is extended, and then there are about 300 to 350 alveoli. So at a higher rate, so this will help you in exchange of the gases. The exchange of gases occurs at a point where there are a lot of capillaries, and the capillaries exchange this particular gases between the tissues. So what happens at the alveoli? The tissues which are present outside will give out the carbon dioxide to the alveoli, and in turn the alveoli will give the exchange of oxygen towards the tissues. So that we call it as the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. So when I fill oxygen in the blood, we call it as the oxygenated blood. And when I remove, so when I have more of carbon dioxide, we call it as deoxygenated blood. Okay, now coming to the next most important part we haven't touched, that is the lungs. So we all know there are a pair of lungs. Lungs are a spongy air sacs, that is, they are like a sponge, and there are two in number, that is the right lung as well as the left lung. And you always find both the lungs are not of the same size. The right lung is slightly larger than the left lung. Why is that so? Because the left side of the lung will have a small notch-like structure. So here the lung, you can see it has a small depression or a notch-like structure. Now this is to accommodate the tip of the heart, so that because the heart's tip, that is the ventricle, is on to the left side. Now you will find that the right lung is little bigger than compared to that of the left lung. Now there is a small notch which helps you to keep the heart in that particular position. So that is about the lung. Okay, the lungs are all covered by a double membrane structure. Now, what are the membranes called of the lungs? They are called as the pleural membranes. They are called as the pleural membranes. So you have an outer pleural membrane and you have an inner pleural membrane. In between the pleural membranes, you have a cavity. So you have lungs, which are two, and in between you have a gap or a place where it is filled with a kind of fluid. Now this fluid is called as the pleural fluid. Now what is the function of this pleural fluid? Now this pleural fluid, which helps the lungs to protect itself from any kind of injury or any kind of shocks. So any external changes or the shocks from the environment is all protected by means of this pleural fluid. Now this pleural fluid is very important for the lungs to protect themselves. Now this is the general structure of the lungs, and they're all spongy in nature. They have a lot of alveoli inside, the tertiary bronchi ending up in bronchioles. All these you can see inside the lungs. Now, since we have understood what is the mechanism of breathing, how it happens and all those things, what are the general respiratory problems you come across? Many people are born with certain kinds of problems like the asthma. You might also have a wheezing in a younger age. Now this asthma and wheezing are all allergies. Now wheezing happens seasonally, but asthma is a condition where there is a shortness of breath. And this is generally seen as a genetic condition. It comes right from your childhood. Now, what is the necessity that you have to keep your lungs, all of them, in the proper way, that is in a healthy way. So healthy lungs always are important because you have to protect your body, because without oxygen, you all know you cannot survive. Now, common respiratory problems I have given here. Now, coming to the general diseases you come across with the respiratory. You all know the important one, that is lung cancer, which comes generally through smoking. Okay, which comes through smoking. Now, you have pneumonia, which is also the inflammation of the lung. And you all know it is caused by a bacteria. In pneumonia, the whole lung gets affected. Now you have bronchitis, which is very common. It comes with a cough. And bronchitis is the inflammation of the bronchi. The primary, tertiary bronchi and all those things, bronchitis. So lung cancer, pneumonia, bacteria, and then pneumonia bacteria cause this particular bacteria causes pneumonia. Then you have the bronchitis. Then you have another disease which is called as the emphysema. Now this emphysema, the major cause of this particular disease is smoking. Even though we see a lot of captions on the cigarettes saying, say no to tobacco or smoking is injurious, we still tend to smoke because it becomes an addiction. And people think that taking 1 cigarette a day or 10 cigarettes a day will not do any damage to that particular lung, but over a period of time, there are a lot of changes. Now, this emphysema caused by smoking will produce a kind of substance which is called a star. Now, this star is dark in color and it occupies the spaces inside the lungs. Now, what happens? There will not be place for the oxygen to come inside. So what happens? They end up in having less oxygen. So they all have less oxygen, which is called as a hypoxia. Now, When this happens, you will form breathlessness and your lung will be infected, this particular one. There's one more disease which is called as the COPD. And this is also a disease caused by smoking, where the lungs are all blocked due to this particular tar material which comes from the smoke, because you all know cigarettes contain a lot of carbon and they all end up in forming carcinogenic. Now, this particular disease, which is called as the chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, will finally lead to lung cancers because the lungs are completely damaged. Now, these are some of the things which have, so say no to tobacco. That's the best thing you can avoid to have respiratory problems. Okay, now with this, we understood what are the different parts of the respiratory system, how are lungs present, and what is the place where the lungs are present, and what is that which guards the lungs and the heart, and what are the difficulties in respiration, and how does the respiratory process take place. Now, all these we have understood. Let's look at some of the questions which are being asked generally. Now, what are the characteristics of an ideal respiratory surface? We have already given this. So an ideal respiratory surface should have the following things. So it should have a respiratory capacity, that is absorptive capacity. So it should be enough, that is, it can take in more amount of air. Now, it has to have a large amount of absorptive capacity, that just like the alveoli we have seen. And the exchange of gases which takes place should be done in a normal manner. You should not have any problems with the gaseous exchange. The surface has to be ideal for this particular gaseous exchange. Now, alveoli, you know, which has greater absorptive capacity, will be the ideal place for having this particular respiration. Now, coming to the next one, breathing is a rhythmic process where exchange of gases is continuous. Now, breathing is done only when you take in air or when you leave out air. Now, that is a simple mechanical process we talked about. Okay, so this occurs by itself. You take in air, you leave out. It's a rhythmic process. It takes that 12 to 15 times. You keep breathing and breathing out. Now, but inside the lungs, what happens? The air is constantly being picked up by the capillaries through the alveoli. So the exchange of gases in the alveoli is a continuous process. It has to give to the tissues. It has to collect carbon dioxide from the tissues. So it is a continuous process. Whereas breathing occurs only 12 to 15 times a minute. The rest of that is a continuous process. Now, have you ever thought why lungs cannot collapse? Just like we said, trachea cannot collapse. What makes the lungs not to collapse? Why? Because just like you saw trachea had the rings of cartilage, in lungs you do not find cartilaginous rings, but you see the lungs have little amount of air always. They always have that little amount of air. Now, the air which is present in this lungs, a little amount of air which will not allow the lungs to collapse, is called the residual air. Now, if this air is present, the lungs will not fall into position. Remember, you don't breathe in, breathe out 100%. There is always a little amount of air left over in the lungs. Now, that leftover air is called the residual air. Now, exchange of gases takes place in the alveoli. We already discussed the respiratory act, because that is the place where you have a lot of capillaries. And you all know the capillaries are the areas where exchange of gases takes place. And this is the great absorptive area for gases to work. Coming to the regular questions which are being asked, describe the mechanism of breathing in human beings. Now, this question, you can write what is exhalation, what is inspiration, and then you can give the steps, how the thoracic cavity changes during this particular process. And if at all, you can draw a small diagram to explain that. Now, next one, give reasons for the following. Glottis is covered by epiglottis, because glottis is an organ and epiglottis is a flap-like structure. And glottis doesn't move when it opens into the pharynx, that is into the digestive system or into the respiratory system. It is only the epiglottis which moves because it is a flap-like structure. So only epiglottis can move, and glottis is a gland, it cannot move. Okay. So lung alveoli are covered with blood capillaries, obviously because you have exchange of gases here, right? So since you need exchange of gases, you need capillaries at the alveoli level. Now, wall of the trachea is supported by cartilaginous rings. Now, this is also the same. It is with this C-shaped rings of cartilage, which will help the trachea to stay in that particular position, and it will not collapse when air is not present. So you need this cartilage rings. And remember, the rings of cartilage are not complete rings. So we said they are incomplete, that is C-shaped rings. It is not complete ring. It is not complete ring. Now, is hemoglobin the only pigment? So we just discussed that hemoglobin is the major pigment found in most of the animals. But apart from hemoglobin, we have other types of pigments. Hemerythrin. You also have hemocyanin. So these are some of the pigments you can find. Hemocyanin, lower organisms, mollusca, arthropods, some of the arthropods do have, and this cyanin is copper. Remember, hemoglobin is an iron-carrying pigment. So you have heme, which is iron, and a globin protein. Hemocyanin doesn't have iron, it has copper. And this hemerythrin is similar to hemoglobin, but only difference is hemerythrin does not have as much as capacity to carry oxygen like this particular hemoglobin. So we do find other respiratory substances, but hemoglobin is present in the maximum number of animals. So in animals, we give hemoglobin to be the most abundant pigment for carrying oxygen. So that's all for today. So we will continue in the next session. We will start a new topic, which is called as a circulatory system, that then we'll talk about blood and other things. So thank you.